Hi, I'm Mari, and I'm making a little video guide for manual marking top. This video will go over only P5, as the marks used in P3 are exclusively to make the conga lines easier to read. A slideshow version of this video will be in the description made by one of my friends. Included in the description as well will be a simulator to practice manually marking players. To start off, what you'll need is to have the signs menu open, or move some of these signs to be bound to the buttons on your hotbar. You can also keybind these on your hotbar as well to mark players. I find this a bit slow, so I use party list macros. The party list macros will be shown on screen and in the description. My hotbar is 10% smaller than my party list, so it lines up with all the players. First and foremost, Delta. Delta is not really mandatory to mark. The only people who need marking are the near and far world debuff players, but that's optional. Blue players should be looking at their debuffs to see what they have anyway. If they have nothing, they just go to the side. If they have either of the near far worlds, you go to your assigned spot. The remaining players have static spots depending on if they're inner or outer tethers, so you won't really need to worry about marking them. Sigma is where it starts to get complicated. After Delta, we are left with 6 players who have 1 stack of Dynamis and 2 players who have 0 stacks. You will need to have players marked for the big spinner in the middle. We need 3 players to go north, and these players have to have 1 stack of Dynamis and no near far world debuff. Due to the fact that 6 players have 1 stack, no matter what the near far worlds go on, we will always have 4 or more players who qualify to go north. Try to prioritize a tank to be a bind player, as this makes healing easier later in the fight. After you mark the bind players and the 1 player, the remaining players will either have 1 or 0 stacks that don't have near far world. These players are optional to mark, but if they are not marked, we want to have the near far world players stand a bit closer to mid before it starts spinning, as the remaining 3 players are able to body language where they're going. Looking at this example, I solved the marking by going down from my player list. From top to bottom, the White Mage, Warrior, and Sage are the first 3 I can see that have 1 stack of Dynamis and no near far world. So I mark them as binds and 1, prioritizing the Warrior to be a bind due to being a tank. After you mark these 3, there will be 3 more players that can be marked. The Gunbreaker, Monk, and Black Mage are all 1 or 0 stack players with no near far world debuff. So you can mark these optionally, but the bare minimum is to just mark the binds and the 1. Something small I keep in my head to alleviate the thinking is to remember that any player who has 0 stacks of Dynamis is guaranteed to be a baiter, because they cannot go into Omega with less than 1 stack. Remember to ignore the near far worlds, because they do not want to be marked, as they already know where they're going. If everything is done correctly, you should always have 4 players with 2 stacks of Dynamis and 4 players with 1 stack of Dynamis. Coming into Omega, this is the hardest mechanic to mark by far, as you have a lot of prios to look out for, a short time to do it, a 2-minute window, and predation dodges. I highly recommend only being a marker here if you're a healer or a job with a lazy burst window, like, I don't know, Black Mage or something. At the minimum, the players that need to be marked here are the 2 monitor players, and 1 player to go north as a 1 mark, and 1 player to go south as a 4 mark. Everything after that is optional. The optional baits are the 2 and 3, and then the near far world debuffs. In order to qualify to be a monitor player, you need to have 2 stacks of Dynamis at the minimum, with players having 2 stacks and second in line being mandatory to mark. You will never mark a player with 1 stack as a monitor, as they will only be at 2 stacks by the end of Omega Part 2. The players who need to be marked as 1 to 4 are players who have 1 stack, with priority given to second in line players, and 2 stacks if they are remaining after you mark the binds. If you do not decide to mark 2 and 3, players who do not have a mark on their head will have to look at their debuff, and if they're first in line, they go to their according spot. If they have no first in line, they will head to bait the near world as either a 2 or 3. They can body language easily to make sure they don't overlap. Here's my personal order of operations for marking. You don't have to follow this, but this works for me. Always mark the second in line players first. A second in line with 1 stack will always be a Dynamis baiter, and a second in line with 2 stacks will always be a monitor baiter. Depending on if you have 2 second in line players marked bind, 2 second in line players marked baiters, or anything in between, you will need to fill in the rest by marking the 4 remaining non-debuff players. For example, if 2 binds were placed on the second in lines, mark the rest as 1 to 4. If 2 baits were marked on the second in lines, mark 2 players with 2 stacks of Dynamis as binds and the remaining 2 as baiters. If you have 1 bind and 1 baiter as your second in lines, you'll need to just find 1 player with 2 stacks to mark as bind and the remaining players are baiters. Let's take a look at this example. The warrior and the sage are second in line players. The warrior has 1 stack of Dynamis while the sage has 2 stacks. This means the warrior will be a baiter and the sage will be a bind player. Because of this, we have to mark one other player as a bind. Going down the party list afterwards, the remaining players eligible to be marked are the white mage with 1 stack, the gunbreaker with 1 stack, the monk with 2 stacks, the samurai with 2 stacks. You can ignore the first in line players as they will already know where to go. I end up marking the white mage and gunbreaker as a baiter, the monk as the second bind, and the samurai as the baiter. If I were to do the bare minimum, I would simply mark the sage and monk as binds, and then since the warrior would be marked as a baiter, or as 1, I simply get to choose any of the remaining 3 players to be a 4, and that's my job done. For Omega Part 2, marking is entirely optional. 2 players will have 3 stacks of Dynamis, so they will be taking the loop or tether. 2 players will have the near far world debuffs, so they will have to go to their respective spots. The remaining 4 players will all have 2 stacks of Dynamis, and simply need to body language their way into the 4 baiter spots. You have about 18 seconds to resolve this. Just remember to clear the marks after part 1 resolves. Good luck.